Hello, in this video I'll be showing you how to make pot roast with vegetables and potatoes. I always start the pot roast by preparing the vegetables and potatoes first, so then I can use the same cutting board to prepare the raw meat. First, I'm large slicing a medium-sized yellow onion. I like the flavor of the yellow onion with the other ingredients that go into the pot roast, and the yellow onion also holds up really well to the long bake time for the pot roast. Then I large dice medium-sized yellow potatoes. I have 4 on the cutting board here because they weren't going to last too much longer, but I actually only used 2 for this recipe. I prefer to use yellow potatoes rather than russet or other types of potatoes for this recipe. Because these potatoes are going to be in the oven for such a long period of time, I want to make sure that they hold some texture and don't turn to mush. Then I separate the onions and the potatoes into 2 different bowls because I'll be adding them at different times. And with the onions, I add in some baby carrots. I use about 1.5 cups of baby carrots, but you can use more or less based on what you like in the recipe. If you don't have baby carrots, you can use larger carrots and cut them to size, but I find this is a great time saver. Here I'm going through the baby carrots and taking out any that have dirty or rotten ends and cutting those off. Next, I prepare and large dice 7 cloves of garlic, and then I add the garlic into the bowl with the carrots and onions. Now that the vegetables and potatoes are prepared, it's time to start working on the meat. I pat the meat dry and then generously season the top and bottom with salt and pepper. When I flip the meat over to the back, I see a large brown spot. This could be an area where the meat was exposed to oxygen. Raw beef that's brown can sometimes be a reflection that the meat has started to rot or spoil. However, in this case, the meat wasn't slimy and didn't have a bad odor. But to be safe rather than sorry, I did go ahead and cut off that brown piece. Then I continue with seasoning and season this side of the meat with salt and pepper. While I'm seasoning, I also have my skillet on the stovetop heating to high heat. Once the skillet is very hot, I lay the meat down on one side to sear it. The skillet should be hot enough that the meat sizzles as soon as you lay it down. I sear this side of the meat for 3 to 3.5 minutes, and then I flip it over and sear the other side for an additional 3 to 3.5 minutes. I don't add any oil or any additives into the pan while I'm searing the meat. The crust and flavor is formed by the meat cooking in the fat that melts off as it sears. While the meat is searing, I combine 1 cup of red wine and 1/3 cup of balsamic vinegar. As I've mentioned in other videos, the type of wine that you're using for this recipe should be good enough to drink. This time I used a red blend. I prepare these liquids while the meat is still searing because I'm going to use this to deglaze the pan, and I want to add it into the pan to deglaze as soon as I remove the meat. This will prevent any of the juices from the meat from carbonizing before we get the sauce in. I give a light sear to each of the edges of the meat just to lock in some moisture, and then I place the meat into a Dutch oven. As soon as the meat is out of the skillet, I pour in the wine and balsamic vinegar. I also turn off the heat at this point. I stir regularly to make sure the wine and balsamic vinegar are mixing in together and mixing in with any of the leftover juices that are in the pan. I keep heating the wine and balsamic vinegar in the pan for another 2 to 3 minutes or until the liquid content is reduced by about 1/4. Then I pour this liquid over the meat in the Dutch oven. Next, I add in the carrots, onions, and garlic that we had previously prepared. I'm trying to get these around the edges of the roast rather than on top of the roast. Then I add in some fresh thyme and some fresh rosemary. I like to add about 5 sprigs of each. My rosemary plant is starting to go dormant for the winter, so rather than cutting off too much, I supplement some of the rosemary with dried rosemary from the pantry. Finally, I add in 2 cups of beef broth. Based on the size of your roast and of your Dutch oven or roasting pan, you might not need this much liquid. If that's the case, don't use all of the beef broth. I place a lid on the pan and then put it into the oven to bake at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour. After I put the roast in the oven, I prepare the potatoes, which I'll add into the roast after it's baked for 1 hour. To prepare them, I'm simply using some balsamic vinegar, some salt, and some pepper. These will marinate in the balsamic vinegar for that full hour, which really brings on a lot of flavor and helps tenderize the potatoes. I add the potatoes in after 1 hour because I found that if I add them in at the start, they just turn to mush and don't have a lot of texture. The total length of time that I cook the roast is based on the size of the roast. So for a 3-pound roast, I cook it for at least 3.5 hours, and every additional pound I add an additional 45 minutes to 1 hour. The cooking time can vary based on how many vegetables and potatoes I add in, how much liquid is in the pot, and how much fat is cooking out of the roast. It can also depend just on how much time I have left before we need to serve dinner. Regardless, the longer that I can cook the roast, the more tender it will be. It's more of a risk to undercook the pot roast than to overcook the pot roast. This is because pot roast is traditionally made from a really tough cut of meat that's mostly made from muscle and doesn't have a lot of fat or marbling. Cooking the pot roast for a long time at a lower temperature, like 275 degrees Fahrenheit, helps break down the muscle tissue and makes the meat more tender. The risk of overcooking the meat can lead to dry meat, but with how much liquid we're adding into this pan, there's really a low risk of having a dry roast. This was a 4-pound roast that I cooked for just over 4.5 hours. After I pulled it out of the oven, I let it sit for about 10 minutes to cool off a little bit, and then I started to scoop out some of the roast and potatoes and vegetables to serve for dinner. I put the potatoes and vegetables into a serving platter, and I ladled out some of the au jus into a sauce boat. If you would like, you could take out some of the liquid and thicken it into a gravy using cornstarch or flour. However, I prefer to use it as a thin sauce and pour it over the top of the meat and vegetables and potatoes. Thanks for watching this video on how to make pot roast with vegetables and potatoes. Let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.